interesting how Washington works in this nature. You see these people who go into government and come back out and then go in again, and you see this across all different cabinets and agencies. And part of the reason for that is, number one, going into government actually requires a good amount of sacrifice. You do end up, especially at these high-level positions, making a lot less money working in that field. And frankly, depending on the policies that you pursue, you can actually end up closing off different avenues for income afterwards to yourself, depending on what you do in that role. In addition, it's kind of a thankless job, particularly as at the cabinet position, less so at the Federal Reserve, because not only is every decision you make scrutinized, but you're dealing with a bevy of civilian workers, of professional staff underneath you, who, particularly under Republican administrations, often disagree with everything that you're trying to do, and therefore try to throw all sorts of different, all sorts of different barriers for you to try to achieve what your various policy goals are. And finally, I think that there's a certain attitude among people that used to be in place in America that doesn't really exist anymore, and that's just this concept of duty. You know, Herbert Hoover, when he went and ran the Commerce Department, was actually one of the most prominent Americans. He was a guy who was extremely beloved because of his work in saving the lives of millions in Europe with the food program, everything like that. You don't see anybody at that sort of tier level of people going into government.
John Kerry is that man.
Besides the fact we're seeing a lot of the same names, Buck, do you think you can read into their ideology or how a Romney administration might look? The fact that you've got a guy who might have a more active monetary policy name up there, can you read into this?
If you're going to find somebody in the U.S. government who wants to both be considered and really act as a technocrat, you're going to find it in somebody like the Federal Reserve Chairman. That's why a lot of these names are coming up. It's a very specific skill set that tends to find, there's only certain resumes that are going to be acceptable to the people making the decisions about who's going to get those jobs. But a couple things I would add to what Ben said. One is that when some of these very senior people leave places like, for example, Goldman Sachs to go work as senior advisors, it's not as bad as people think, because they have to, in order to avoid conflicts of interest, dump stock that they have. They don't pay federal income tax on that. For some of these guys, that is tens of millions of dollars. So that's for one thing. Just throwing that out there. And then the other side of it is that if they don't happen to have a lot of exercisable options, for example, that they then just have to release so they don't have a conflict of interest before they go work for the government, which isn't as bad as it sounds. Then afterwards, they get to be on the boards of endless companies. They show up every quarter. They get paid an outrageous salary. It's not a bad gig.
Only one disappointed disagreement with you on that, Buck, and that's this. When you actually look at the people who end up in these roles, Donald Rumsfeld, I was interviewing him recently, said no one will take a position in the next cabinet unless they can afford to spend the rest of their life fighting the litigious people who come after.
Look, let's move on past economic policy for 1 minute and talk about Secretary of State, because Hillary Clinton has also said she's out. Let's look at the duties of Secretary of State, what exactly that office entails. It's promoting peace and stability in regions of vital interest, creating jobs at home by opening markets abroad, helping develop nations establish investment and export opportunities, and bringing nations together and forging partnerships, yada, 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 make the world a better place. What names are being bandied about for that? Well, first of all, if it's President Obama, Susan Rice, UN ambassador, of much controversy, is talked about being bumped up, and Senator John Kerry from Massachusetts. His name is being talked about for Secretary of State. If Mitt Romney wins the presidency, Richard Haass, president of the Council on Foreign Relations, he's been involved again in government at high levels of previous administrations, and Bob Zoellick, basically the same resume, World Bank, government insider, high levels of government prior to this mention in previous administrations. Essie, Amy, what do you think about some of these names? Is it all the same?
I think when you look at Secretary of State, you see a lot more politics coming into play and who is chosen to fill that slot, whether there's political payback. So, for example, Hillary Clinton being tapped to be Secretary of State under Obama's administration, this current administration. You're also looking at the politics of the Senate. Would it advantage Romney or Obama to choose someone from the opposite party to take them out of the Senate and put them into the Secretary of State slot? I would also add to whoever gets one of these positions that being politically savvy, knowing the players, knowing how to play the PR game in Washington is also very important consideration for who the president picks. We've seen with Stephen Chu, he tends to shoot his mouth off, and that hasn't necessarily made the administration so happy. I love it, but it's not a great recommendation for the cabinet member.
The other thing that is interesting to notice is that you are seeing a return to a lot of old familiar faces who have worked in previous administrations, and I think that speaks to the sort of psychological mood of the country. We want people who have been there before. We want people, regardless in whichever administration, We want grown-ups, and if they've had experience, we're not willing to roll the dice and put in Timothy Geithners and people who are coming from the outside, like Obama was in 2008 when there was all of this hope and change, and we're going to have a new kind of Washington and a new kind of White House. I think there's a sense that we need to get people who've done this before.
You know what would be great?